their youngest daughter, Lydia, who is very flirtatious, attention-seeking, and a bit reckless. Mrs. Bennet says, "You're always biased towards her." Mr. Bennet replies, "None of them are anything special. They're just like other girls, foolish and ignorant, but Lizzie is a bit more clever than her sisters." So, you see, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are completely different. Mr. Bennet favors his second daughter because she's smart. When Mrs. Bennet hears this, she almost loses it, saying, "You don't understand my poor nerves at all. How can you talk about our daughter like that?" This is Mrs. Bennet's way of showing weakness and complaining. Mr. Bennet says, "You're misunderstanding me, dear. I hold your nerves in the highest regard. They've been my old friends for at least 20 years. It's a resigned complaint, implying she's too nagging." So, we see that Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have very different personalities. Mr. Bennet is eccentric, quick-witted, and enjoys making sarcastic remarks, but he's also reserved, introverted, and likes to do his own thing. Even after 32 years of marriage, Mrs. Bennet still can't quite figure him out. In contrast, Mrs. Bennet is simpler to understand. She's not very bright, narrow-minded, and moody, and she sometimes thinks she has neurasthenia. Her main job in life has been to marry off her daughters. What kind of daughters would such a couple raise? Soon, the 5 Bennet sisters and their friends make their debut at a ball. Why is the ball so important? The book says, "Loving to dance is an essential step in courtship." What does that mean? It reflects a social rule from England at the time, which was how unmarried girls could enter social circles and start the path to romance. They had to officially enter the social scene. In the high society of England back then, unmarried women needed to be accompanied by an older female, like a family member or governess. Also, if there was an older daughter still unmarried, the younger sisters had to follow the rules. No dating, at least not marrying. The aristocratic activities of the time seem pretty limited by today's standards, mainly dancing, hunting, playing chess, or cards. Dancing was the main way for young people to meet. To fit into the local scene quickly, Mr. Bingley's family hosted a ball as soon as they arrived in Netherfield. It's at this ball that Elizabeth first meets Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley's family includes 2 sisters, a brother-in-law, and his friend Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley is charming, friendly, and down-to-earth. His sisters are elegant and fashionable. His brother-in-law is unremarkable, but Mr. Darcy, his friend, is tall, handsome, and has a noble presence. As soon as Mr. Darcy arrives, he attracts everyone's attention. Within 5 minutes of his arrival, it's already known that Mr. Darcy has an income of £10,000 a year. You see, gossip travels fast. We already knew Mr. Bingley was wealthy, with an income of £4,000 to £5,000 a year, so Mr. Darcy must be even more impressive. Maybe because of his money, people started praising Mr. Darcy as the epitome of a catch. The men admired him, and the women claimed he was even more handsome than Mr. Bingley. For nearly half the evening, people looked at him with admiration. He was the toast of the ball. But Mr. Darcy quickly ruined his good impression. Why? His behavior was awful. People found him arrogant and aloof, unable to be pleased by anyone, especially compared to Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley quickly mingles with everyone in the ballroom. He is lively, open, and dances with everyone, making him naturally likable. He is friendly to everyone, so people feel valued. But Mr. Darcy is different. He refuses to dance and won't meet new people. According to the social rules of the time, especially when there are more women than men, a well-mannered gentleman should politely and actively invite the ladies to dance. Only by doing so would all the ladies have a chance to dance. That's what makes a gentleman. But Mr. Darcy clearly doesn't care about pleasing others, so everyone decides he is the most arrogant and disagreeable person, hoping he won't come around again. At the ball, Mr. Bingley is instantly smitten with Elizabeth's sister Jane, calling her the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. But Mr. Bingley also tries to get Mr. Darcy to invite Elizabeth to dance, suggesting, "Look at that pretty younger sister over there. She's lovely too. You should meet her." But Mr. Darcy flatly refuses, saying after a glance at Elizabeth, "She's all right, but not pretty enough to make me interested." This deeply offends Elizabeth. People don't like having their appearance criticized, and Elizabeth is no exception. So from this moment, Elizabeth's first impression of Mr. Darcy is established. Prejudice. The worst thing about prejudice is that it creates a rigid system in our minds. Elizabeth believes Mr. Darcy is arrogant and rude, unworthy of respect or trust. This affects her judgment of him, making her unable to think objectively about the complex reality. Instead, she's inclined to believe any bad news about him. So Elizabeth immediately decides Mr. Darcy is very arrogant and selfish, even though she doesn't really know him. Her prejudice against Darcy deepens once again when Elizabeth by chance meets a handsome man named Wickham. At first, Wickham makes a great impression on Elizabeth, even making her slightly infatuated with him. Wickham is not only handsome and cheerful, but also charming and well-spoken, without being overly familiar. But in reality, Wickham is a typical scoundrel, irresponsible and deceitful. He deliberately tarnishes Darcy's reputation by telling Elizabeth that he was close with Darcy's father. He claims that Darcy's father had asked him to look after Wickham, but Darcy ignored his father's wishes and mistreated him. When Elizabeth hears this from Wickham, she believes him without a second thought. That's prejudice. Even when Miss Bingley later tells her that's not true, and the facts are different from what Wickham said, Elizabeth remains unmoved. She firmly believes that Darcy is not only arrogant, but also deceitful and mean. At this point, it's clear that things are getting complicated. Elizabeth's negative impression of Darcy seems hard to undo, and to make matters worse, something happens involving Elizabeth's beloved sister Jane. Since the ball, Jane has been smitten with Mr. Bingley. She'll confide in Elizabeth, just like we do with our close friends. She says, young men should be like him. She's talking about Bingley. In public, Jane hides her feelings, but when alone, she's completely open. She describes Bingley as knowledgeable, funny, and lively, saying she's never met anyone as delightful as him, so easygoing and impeccably polite. Elizabeth immediately says, he's also very handsome. Young men should be good-looking, provided they can make it. Everything seems perfect, and Jane is thrilled. She says, when Bingley asked me to dance for the second time, I was so flattered. I didn't expect him to think so highly of me. Notice how different Jane and Elizabeth are. Jane is gentle, cautious, and good at restraining herself. She's very considerate. Because of this, Bingley doesn't realize Jane's true feelings for him. He even thinks she's not interested, which is what happens when someone is too considerate and ends up causing misunderstandings. Soon after, Elizabeth hears some news from one of Darcy's cousins. During a casual conversation, the cousin mentions that Bingley wanted to pursue Jane further. However, Darcy advised against it, suggesting that they might not be a good match. As a result, Bingley decides to abandon his interest in Jane. You can imagine how furious Elizabeth is, knowing her sister's deep feelings for Bingley. Instead of analyzing what might have caused this and how to resolve it, she blindly concludes that Darcy is the villain. She believes he must be prejudiced against her family's poverty, and deliberately sabotage Jane and Bingley's potential engagement, which leaves Jane heartbroken. At this point, Elizabeth's misunderstanding of Darcy is at its peak. But poor Mr. Darcy, the so-called arrogant one, is unaware of this.